Okay, welcome everyone. This is our fourth installment of our virtual tasting panel. I'm glad you could join us here for Ridge Vineyard's look at a number of interesting library wines this week. And today we have 4 panelists to join us. And I think I'm going to start by introducing someone new to this adventure. Paul hasn't made our earlier ones, but Paul Draper, our longtime winemaker, former CEO, and now chairman of the board of Ridge. So Paul, say hi to everyone.
Hi, great to be here. Great to see people's faces at a distance.
Yeah. So then on my other side of my screen, at least, is our winemaker and chief operating officer at Montebello, Eric Baher.
Hi.
Okay. And then below me, I've got John Olney, who is our chief operating officer and winemaker, head winemaker at the Lytton Springs Winery. Hey, John.
Hey, everyone.
And then David Gates, our senior vice president of vineyard operations. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Mark. Hi, everybody.
Good. Yeah. All right. So once again, welcome everyone. For those of you who are new to this, for us, I want to give you a little update on Ridge. For those who tuned in the prior weeks, the message is things haven't changed much over the past 4 weeks. Our tasting rooms remain closed. However, we have opened the Lytton Springs facility for drive-by wine pickup. So if you order wine and you live in the North Bay and would like to come by and pick it up, you can do that Wednesday through Sunday at the Lytton Springs facility. You can make a reservation for what time you come, and they'll bring the wine out to your car and put it in the car for you. In the South Bay, we have started a local delivery system. So if you order wine in the South Bay, there's a possibility that it would be delivered to you by Ridge staff. So that's something we've instituted as well during this time with our tasting rooms closed. The vineyards and winery continue to operate as essential businesses. I'm happy to report that so far everybody at Ridge is healthy. Nobody has gotten sick. We're doing everything we can to keep it that way. We have implemented social distancing. We do have people wearing masks at work, and we're sanitizing like crazy. I think Eric has been brewing up sanitizer in the lab
yeah.
on a regular basis. So,
it is, however, hard to be tasting wine with a mask on.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we haven't invented that wine tasting mask yet, but we're working on it. So, nevertheless, with all these measures in place, we have been able to keep operations going and keep the wine in good condition. And of course, the vineyards, they march to the rhythms of nature on their own. They don't care if there's a virus out there or not. They are doing their thing, and Dave and his crew have done a great job of working and keeping the vineyards in good shape so far this year. So with that update, I want to just again let everyone know how this is going to work. You're free, and I can already see there's a lot of chat taking place on the chat function. There's also a Q&A function that's part of this Zoom seminar format. So if you want to ask one of our panelists a question, please do so through the Q&A function. It's a lot easier for us to pick out the questions and then ask the panelists when they are on the Q&A. So sometimes we can't get to all the questions. We've had a lively set of audiences so far with a lot of questions. We'll do the best we can to ask your question live, or perhaps have one of our other staff who's supporting us answer in a typed response for your information. So, but again, feel free to ask questions. That's what makes, I think, these panels and seminars so much fun, is that they can be interactive and we get a chance to engage with you, our customers. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and get to the business at hand, which is tasting these great wines. And the first wine that we are going to taste is the 2014 Boatman Zinfandel. Again, if you don't have these particular wines with you right now, I would let you know that they are available. All 4 of the wines we're going to taste today are available on our website for purchase as library releases to our members in limited quantities. So, but if you want to pull the cork on a different wine, go ahead and do it. I think it's a lot of fun, and sometimes even if you have a question on a different wine, we'd be happy to try to answer that for you as well. So, but let's turn to the 2014 Boatman. And John, if you could tell us a little bit about this vineyard and this wine, that would be great.
Sure. So hi to everyone out there. This is the 2014 Zinfandel from the Boatman Ranch. And 2014 is the first vintage we actually made from this vineyard. It's named after Tim Boatman, who's the owner and is really, you know, the mind behind. He handcrafted the vineyard by terracing a hillside in the Alexander Valley Appalachian. It's really a beautiful vineyard. It's situated sort of halfway between our Geyserville vineyard and our Lytton Springs vineyard. So same general sort of microclimate, but really a terrific place to grow zin. It's primarily Zinfandel, so it doesn't have quite the field blend that some of our zins do. The vines are about 40 years old. David, does that sound about right?
Yes, the oldest vines are 40 years old. He's been replanting and adding on off and on, so I'd say average maybe a little bit less than that, but yes, and all zin.
Right. So, you know, we really don't have, you know, this is obviously the oldest Boatman we have so far. I think it's really, really coming around, developing some complexity. So we don't really know, we don't have a track record, don't know really how long it will age, but, you know, at about 6 years right now, it's really showing well.
John, do you have is the 14 comparable to any of the more recent vintages that you've made, or is it stand more alone as a unique vintage?
Well, 14 was one of the drought years, and being primarily Zinfandel, and the first time we made wine from this vineyard, it was probably, you know, it was definitely on the ripe side when the grapes came in. So I think it stands out a little bit as being sort of more robust than some of the other vintages that we produced since then.
Great.
And I would say this ranch it's very different from East Bench, but because it's 100% zin, it kind of behaves like East Bench. When it gets ripe in a hurry. So it's it's one of those things where it's hurry up and wait, and then all of a sudden jump in and pick it as fast as you can.
Well, yeah, really steep vineyard too. I mean, terraced and really rocky. So I can only imagine the water stress on those vines. And when they do ripen, they go really quick.
Absolutely.
David, you and John had been up there scouting it out and setting it up. And then we all came up to see it and went out in the vineyard in those little off-road, whatever there. And I have never seen such a steep vineyard. I mean, he's planted hillsides that we wouldn't even plant at Montebello. I mean, it is unbelievable.
Yeah, he's quite a character. He's a great guy.
There are some roads that you have to know which way to go down them. Otherwise, you might not make it.
Might not get out.
Yep.
So I was going to say, John, in the sequence of things, does this vineyard ripen earlier than most of the others you work with, or is it later, or where does it fall in the spectrum of?
Well, it's kind of like David was saying. It's you know, you're waiting. It's not the first vineyard to come in, but it's within the first quarter of harvest. But it sort of lags a little bit behind things like East Bench. But when it's ripe, it happens really quickly.
Yeah, it's going to ripen pretty close to about the same time Geyserville. Some of the first blocks at Geyserville.
Early to mid September.
Yeah.
And as far as the barrel aging for this wine, is it fairly similar to what we do with our other Zinfandel wines?
Yeah, it is. Like all of our wines, it's aged in American oak. About 20% is new, and then it's a range of barrels that are 5 to 6 years old from that point on.
I love the tobacco in it, especially on the nose. It's really nice and very soft on the palate.
Yeah, it's super soft and round. I mean, it's it's like John, you say on the label, drink in the 5 to 6 year period, and here we are.
Yeah, I think
it's right there.
It's
well, Eric, you double decanted, right? So
yeah, I did. I double decanted everything.
When I first opened it, it was very approachable and very well defined. But as John says, there's that richness back there of that first year.
Yeah,
super smooth.
Yeah, it's nice. I think it's really turning a corner. Starting to get some of the secondary aromas.
So, John, I think were you the first one to actually go and visit the vineyard and take a look at it?
Well, I think David and I went together.
Okay.
Yeah, and met Tim, and he took us to his man cave, and served us some great Italian food. He's a real great guy. He's all in.
And what would you say attracted you to the vineyard in terms of us taking a chance on making wine from those grapes?
Well, we'd known the people who the Bilberos who bought the fruit before, so we had good background information from them, and it was clear also, and it's really important when you're purchasing grapes from a grower that it's someone who wants to work with you, who you can work with, and that became apparent immediately. That Tim Boatman is he's a real great farmer, but he's willing to take input from David. Picks whenever we want. So it's been a really great relationship.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think that having that kind of grower to work with really makes our job that much easier, because when the fruit comes to the winery in really good condition, it certainly makes the job of making great wine a little bit easier. So that's great.
It shows in the glass too. I mean, yeah.
Okay, I think we're gonna move on to the next wine that we have to taste, which is the 2013 Geyserville. So Eric, tell us.
Yeah. Well, it comes again from another drought year. It was the second year into that 5-year period where we had very little rainfall. 13, though, the difference there was that it wasn't as dry as 14. I mean, we got rain later in the spring, so that kind of helped get the vines through that summer. Summer that year was not so hot. It actually was kind of a moderate summer that allowed for really good uniform ripening. It's very similar to 2018 in terms of growing condition, and it's rare that you find that level of uniform ripening with Zinfandel, because it is kind of a challenging grape variety to get to have uniform ripening, because it's not grown on a trellis system, and it's all bush vines, head pruned vines, and so with that you have to do a lot of canopy management to get just the right amount of sunlight into the canopy to help with ripening and development of flavor. But 13, just the conditions of the year, it just really led to that naturally, and it just really made a really deep, really seductive Geyserville. So the vineyard's about a total of 45 acres between what we have at Lytton Ranch and just south of there. It's a uniform soil. It's an alluvial ancient riverbed, so it's rocky, well-drained gravel soil. The oldest vines there are from the 1890s. The younger vines is what Ridge planted in 1990 as we signed a 32-year lease with the family. And so with that, we were able to plant some of our favorite heritage selections of Zinfandel. So that block is always the first to come off. Usually early September is when we're bringing in the pure Zinfandel blocks. And then, you know, through the month of September and into early October is when the more mixed older blocks begin to ripen and come off. And everything's fermented separately. So we kind of break the vineyard up into roughly 25 pickings. We have small tanks in the winery where we can receive the fruit, carry out natural fermentation, do pump overs to extract, carefully work each tank independently, and then press off, hold these lots separate, and then do an assemblage tasting. So we like to do that after the harvest, after the wine's finished malolactic. 13 vintage, I'm trying to see here on the label whether or not we needed to add calcium carbonate, which we didn't have to in 13. But some years, just because of the fruit there, as it ripens, it's really unusual in that it will hold its acid. So some years the acid's so intense that we have to actually treat it the way we do with Montebello by adding calcium carbonate to the fermenting juice to help reduce some of the acidity. But 13, just the way the season progressed, we were able to get the fruit in. The acidity was not so firm, and it produced a really beautiful wine. But we do like to do the assemblage after the malolactic so that we're tasting wine that's in a much more finished state, so we can do a very careful selection and, you know, be able to blind taste and pick and choose the most distinctive of the vintage to assemble to make a really beautiful Geyserville. And this is our longest running Zinfandel production at Ridge. It goes back to 1966 when Ridge made the first Geyserville. And so we have this long history. We know that personality of that vineyard very well. And so as we're blind tasting to assemble, we can really find those lots that have the strongest vineyard character displaying, and then see how well they blend together to see if, you know, the Zin plays well with Carignan and Petit Syrah, which in this vintage, it actually did a fair amount of Carignans in the blend, so 17%. We do have a couple blocks that are pure Carignan, so they're fermented separately, and then by taste, we can add those. And so the percentage can go up and down depending on whether or not one or two are held out.
So Paul, tell us a little bit about what that Carignan and the Petit Syrah bring to the Geyserville from your perspective.
Well, the great thing about that Carignan is that it was planted back before the turn of the century. And so there's some of our oldest vines on Geyserville, and it's always been at the heart of the matter. It gives firmer acidity. It also gives a more immediately appealing wine. For example, unlike I think the rest of you, or at least Eric, who double decanted these, which we recommend, I opened them without decanting. And of this whole group, the one that was the most immediately appealing was the Geyserville. It was just unbelievably delicious, right, having just pulled the cork. And yet now, having decanted it and tasting it, again, it's got the structure to go on and age as well as any of the wines. So it really is that way. But I think that Carignan allows that immediate appeal. And there's less Petit Syrah, so quite a bit less, and yet that's there for to help with structure and spice. But this 6.5-year-old Geyserville, I think, Eric, I think you said 10 years.
Yeah,
it's gonna go. It's gonna go on for at least 15 or
it's gonna be a really long,
years.
long-lived Geyserville.
Yeah,
it's a beautiful vintage.
Yeah. No, we got really good concentration that year in the grapes, and you know the way we work the fermenters and do pump overs, and in some cases we have tanks where we can do submerged cap, where we're keeping the skins under in the fermenting juice, so we have constant continuous extraction, really helps with fleshing out the wine and really building good structure into it. But we don't want to go so hard and so aggressive at extraction that you end up coming out of the fermenter with a massively tannic wine. You know, part of what makes Zinfandel so beautiful is that it's sensuous and it's got good fruit, and we want to make balanced Zinfandel. So we have to really be watching the extraction. And the extraction can change year to year depending on the growing conditions. You know, how concentrated the grapes are. You know, is there an extra seed that's going to contribute more tannin to the wine? You know, how did the seeds ripen? So there's a lot of factors that go into it as we're deciding to pick, and as the fruit's in the fermenter, making those decisions of how much pump over to give and when to press. Once pressed, do you add the pressed wine back or do you hold it out? So there's a lot of critical decisions that are done during the vintage as we're fermenting and assembling the lots. But ultimately what we want is a really beautiful, balanced Zinfandel.
So Dave Gates, tell us a little bit about a little bit more about the impact that the drought had on the vineyards during that period of time.
Yeah, so it kind of varied on the year. So 2012 was very much concentrated. All the way, it was a fairly warm vintage and dry. 2013, as Eric said, well, and I would say the vines, they didn't really even know that there was a drought going on. We got like the same thing happened on several of the other years in the drought where we have these late spring rains. Now, I don't know if that's something that we can kind of count on in the 3 out of 4 years as climate change is happening. But it happened again this year. It happened last year. So, but that helped save the 2013 vintage. Again, another hallmark that we've been seeing with the last few years is a very warm, dry January or February. One of those months, usually our 2 wettest months. In all but the 2 very wet years, 17 and 19. Every other year, besides those 2, we've had 1 or both of those months very dry, and that was what happened in 2013. So the rains kind of came in December. They stopped in January. By February, we were getting bud break, which is a little bit early. Then thankfully, we got some later rains, and the weather was not that warm the whole summer. It was a nice, long, even growing season, and that really helped the vines. So we ended up picking kind of normally, like the beginning of September, we started picking Zin. And so the vines, even though they were into year 2 of a pretty major drought, they didn't stress that much in 13.
So Eric, we have a question a little bit more about the assemblage process in terms of how that's done. How do you have these separate lots that we've picked separately, kept separately when you fermented them, and then it's time to decide what goes together to make up that final wine. So tell us a little bit more about
Well, you know, the history of the vineyard and the blocks, and you know, we've been picking the vineyards the same way pretty much every year based on, you know, the boundaries of a parcel, the area where it is within the vineyard, and, you know, what age of vines, what stress is on those vines. You know, there's some wet spots in the vineyards as you go east. And so those tend to be picked separately as they require more time. So with having history, and we know kind of where the sweet spots of the vineyard are every year where you can reliably make Geyserville quality from, we're carefully fermenting, but still with the blind tasting, you're mixing everything up. You're randomly tasting through the flights of all the possible cubes that make up the entirety of the vintage, and picking and choosing based on really what's in that individual glass from that particular spot of the vineyard. Does it have the Geyserville character? Does it have the kind of the character of fruit that's typical Geyserville, which is tending towards stone fruit, like cherries and plum? You know, does it have, you know, the tannins that are more elegant? You know, does it have high acid, which is also what makes Geyserville so wonderful? And so we're kind of looking for that among all the lots that we're blind tasting. And then once they're identified and we know what is what and what our preferences are, we have to see how well they blend together. So it's really a very similar discipline of how we assemble the Montebello, you know, where it's all blind tasting. And in the case of Geyserville, we're really focused on finding the lots that really speak of Geyserville.
And Eric, the key thing that you said is, just repeated it, it's blind. And also we don't know what part of the vineyard each individual glass came from.
Yeah.
So we're looking at, you know, in a way, in a fresh way, are any of the ones that might not have made it the year before or before that, are they of the Geyserville quality this year? And so we have no prejudices. We're tasting for that Geyserville quality.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't want to have that prejudice. We want to give everything a clear chance to make it into the blend. But a lot of it goes back to just what David's doing in the vineyard on those lots, maybe some of those lots that are more challenging to get into Geyserville. They're working on harder in the vineyard. You know, we're making, you know, more crucial decisions during the vintage of when to pick. So we're always constantly trying to press the quality there and do what we can in the vineyard and in picking decisions and how the fruit's going to be treated in the winery, so that we can ultimately make more Geyserville if we can. But with blind tasting, you never know. It really still comes down to the quality of the vintage.
Right.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about the rate. You know, we've talked a little bit about the age and the ageability of the Geyserville, but talk a little bit more about the range of time that you could cellar this wine and what you might expect over those time periods.
Well, you know, we're getting to the point where I really love to start drinking Geyserville. I mean, at release, the Geyserville can be amazing. It's usually really, you know, fruit forward, really, you know, showing lots of primary jammy fruit. But as it ages and as it gets to about this point, a lot of that youthful fruit dissipates, and more of the beautiful secondary notes, more kind of baked pie and some exotic spice and some really wonderful flavors evolve. And once it kind of hits that point, then it's on that plateau, and it could go out another 25, 30 years and hold that. I mean, I don't know, you can still go back into the 80s and drink Geyservilles that are still showing that beautiful character. And then as you get further beyond that, then they are more, you know, intellectual wines, where they really are starting to get some of the tertiary flavors, and the tannins really do change. The color is also very different, but they're also a wonderful wine to experience. Like when we've done our blind tastings of like the 73 Geyserville Lytton, you know, and going through the years, and just, can you pick out vineyard character, you know, even in an old vintage like that in a blind tasting? And the fact that we still can do that, you know, the vineyard character does still hold with the wine, even with age.
So maybe tell us a little bit about, but maybe Paul, some of your favorite Geyserville vintages, and Eric, if you have some as well.
Yeah.
Well, I was just trying to go through some of the older wines, and I opened an 84 the other night, having no idea, and it was just wonderful. It had begun that tertiary character, and yes, it is intellectual, but I'd say anybody who loves fine wine and the complexity that comes with aging. I mean, one, of course, the tannins begin to really resolve, and the balance, which has been there or wouldn't age that well, is just now come into its own. But the complexity that comes with long aging is really quite surprising. I mean, people that love a lot of fruit, of course, when it's young, that's what it's going to show. But with age, it just comes around. As Eric just said, the 73 and both Geyserville and Lytton are still showing incredibly well today. So we don't expect people to age wines like that, but it is amazing that Zinfandel has, if you make it this way from a great vineyard, has that potential. If it's in balance, it can go out there.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing, I mean, just the way we make wine, I mean, we're not overly processing our grapes as they come in. We're not overworking. So we're going to bottle with wines that have so much more aging potential to begin with, and that they can really last and show their vineyard character for so much longer than the typical Zinfandel in the market.
Good. Okay. Well, I think we should move on to our third wine, which is the 2013 Lytton Springs. And so maybe, John, you can tell us a little bit more about this wine.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's great to have the Geyserville and the Lytton Springs, you know, from the same vintage, especially with little age side by side. This is something that we do, you know, in-house on a regular basis. You know, in terms of Zinfandel, these are the two vineyards that, you know, we really have the most history with. So, so we're able to go back and really taste them blind side by side to, you know, see, you know, what are the, you know, what makes Lytton Springs and Geyserville unique. And, you know, I think that generally, you know, like Eric was saying, and Paul mentioned too, a Geyserville frequently, especially when it's young, it really kind of jumps out of the glass. You know, Lytton Springs, one of the differences is there's more Petit Syrah in the field blend. The soils have a lot more clay in them, which sort of lends itself to a wine that from the get-go tends to be a little bigger shouldered, darker fruit, a little more structured. But as the wines mature, you know, here, you know, they start to come together, I find, a little more. In other words, that they're more kind of similar right at this age, but then, you know, give them another 8 to 10 years and you start to see that they part ways again. But, you know, 2013, really, I think it was a real terrific vintage in the sense that, you know, all of the separate parcels, which we ferment separately and then taste blind, there were so many of them that, you know, were of the quality that we're able to put them in. I mean, it's usually a much more stringent selection process, but in 2013, it was, you know, we really had a lot to work with.
So Paul, one thing we have to have you tell us a little bit of the story of when you first found the Lytton Springs vineyard. It's been requested specifically.
Yeah, okay. In the winter of 71, 72, in a day of pouring rain, I was up in Sonoma looking for old Zinfandel vineyards that had been planted turn of the century or even before. And I stopped into the old Nervo tasting room. And here was this Cadillac pulled up in front. Mine was the only other car. I walked in and there were this very attractive couple, beautifully dressed. She was in furs. And Nervo was pouring out of a gallon jug for them to taste, which is what he sold, was half gallons and gallons. And he poured me a glass and we got talking. And it turned out that the man that was standing there who was from Southern California and who had named the vineyard he had just bought and was selling to Mondavi, he had named after where he lived in Southern California. And so it was calling it the Valley Vista Vineyard. And he said, "Oh, you're from Ridge, and you guys keep wines separately." He said, "Mine is just going into this big pot." He said, "Would you come over with me and take a look at the vineyard? It's only like 2 miles from here." And so we did. And so in this, luckily not driving rain, we walked through these 100-year-old vines. And he said, "Are you interested?" I said, "Absolutely." And with that, we began with the 72 vintage. And after a few years, he was making a little bit on his own. And eventually he began to make it all. But it gave us about 6 or 7 years of realizing that this was one of the most consistent, most complex of the old vineyards. And of course, starting in 1990, we were able to purchase it. And it's been, of course, an estate vineyard ever since. So this for us is one of the great vineyards. And John, just to say, when I first opened this without decanting, where the Geyserville was quite delicious, this still had what you're talking about, that structure and that toughness. And now decanted, it really has come up. It's just, so it's this idea that if a wine is young, especially I would say a Lytton, I think, I don't know how you feel, John, but this is one that if it's really young, can just use that double decanting before serving.
Yeah, I think that's true, and it's I think it's really I think it's important to point out too, because certainly my experience of Zinfandel, certainly prior to coming to Ridge, was that as a general rule, it's a it's a grape that really gives you this tremendous amount of fruit right out of the gate, but it's not something that usually will age that well, especially on its own. But when you have a vineyard like Lytton Springs, like Geyserville, when you have old vines, when you have the field blend, it really takes it to a whole separate level that needs to be treated, as a more serious wine.
So actually, maybe just explain, John, what we've been saying double decanting, but there's a question. What exactly is that?
Yeah, sure. So double decanting, it sounds fancier than it is. It's simply you take the bottle, you open the bottle, you can decant it, for example, into a carafe, and then whether you use a funnel or any other means, you simply pour it back in. So you've decanted it first into a container such as a carafe, and then you've decanted it back into usually the bottle. So you're giving it, twice as much air as if compared to just decanting it into a single container.
It's because it's really that process of pouring, while you're pouring the wine, that exposes all of the wine to a good amount of air. And so that process gives it that twice as much air as you might get from just pouring it into the decanter.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it really helps to open it aromatically, but I think a lot of the wines, we're about to move on to the Montebello, which would be a perfect example. I've had many times young Montebello, which double decanted, but then it really tasted softer, and it tasted much more open the second or even the third day after it's been open. So that exposure to air for wines like this in their youth is really a critical part to them really showing everything that they have.
Great. So the next question, maybe for Dave, you can talk a little bit, because there are questions about the contrast between Lytton Springs and Geyserville. And we've talked a little bit about part of that difference is the makeup of the wines in terms of the secondary grapes, Carignan and Petit Syrah, with more Carignan in the Geyserville, more Petit Syrah in the Lytton. But there's also questions about the vineyard site, the location. Tell us the difference. Contrast the two locations a little bit for us.
Sure, Mark. So they're very close together, even though they're in separate appellations. So Geyserville is in Alexander Valley. It's on the very western edge of Alexander Valley. Lytton Springs is on the very eastern edge of Dry Creek, and it's in this nice little nook of Dry Creek. And in fact, there is one of the springs at Lytton Springs flows into Alexander Valley. So there's a little corner of the property that is in the Alexander Valley watershed. So climate is very similar in both. so warm days, cool nights. They both get some fog influence. They share one soil type. There's one predominant soil series that's in Geyserville. It's like 90% of the vineyard. There's a little bit of that at Lytton, but Lytton then has 5 other soil types in there. All of those having a little more clay in them. So there's more complexity in the soils at Lytton Springs, and those higher clay content soils, they tend to favor Petit Syrah, which is why there was more Petit Syrah planted at Lytton in the old vines than you find at Geyserville. The other thing is there's some bench lands at Lytton Springs which go up about 50 to 80 feet above the floor of the vineyards on the flats. Now that 50, 80 feet doesn't sound like much, but it does make a difference in not just in the aspect and the way the vines receive radiation, but also in the temperature, so that the vines up on the benchlands, they're a little bit warmer at night, a little bit, and about the same temperature during the day. So that helps the Zin, and that's where we have a little bit of our Syrah. Not that we're tasting any Syrah right now, but
yeah.
It does really well up there because of that. So yeah, that's the biggest difference, I think, are the soils. And those soils at Lytton are the ones that have a little bit more clay content in them. There's a little mineral difference too that makes them tighter soils, and the vines struggle more at Lytton, so they're not as big and vigorous as they are at Geyserville, and that shows in the wine too. It makes a more intense wine.
So there's a difference with fog as well between Dry Creek and Alexander, where the fog tends to hang out longer at Geyserville, but then once it burns off, then it gets really hot there, but then the fog moves right back in.
Yeah, so there can be, especially as compared to Lytton, but the heat unit summation is pretty much the same. It is a little bit warmer at Geyserville. Can get a little bit warmer during the day.
So you see bigger delta between day and night?
Yes, a little bit, especially if you compare the benchlands at Lytton to the flats at Geyserville. Yeah.
So let's sort of transition into a more philosophical question for Paul, or to explain, and this has come up in a couple of the questions about the impact of a site and a great vineyard on the wine, and really Ridge's whole approach of single vineyard winemaking and looking for, exceptional vineyards. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I think Geyserville, of course, starting in '66, we had a real chance, at least from '70 on, to realize that we were getting this consistency of character. I mean, nothing to do with us. I mean, we're not playing around with style. We're making that can come from those grapes. And we began to see, I would say, really starting in '70, that there was this consistent quality year after year in the vineyard. And that is what has attracted us most, because what it means is you have a site where the climate and the soils are giving you a distinct character, a distinctive high quality, that you have the chance year after year of making a wine that has that individual character. And when we started making Lytton, '72 again by certainly, '74, we were seeing the same consistency of character. And so those are the two vineyards that from the start we said, someday we have to own these vineyards. And it took us, until '90 to own Linton Springs, but it took us until what, Mark, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, to own Geyserville. But because of that, the fact that here were two vineyards that gave us that consistent, individual, distinctive character, we knew we simply had to, at some point, have those as estate vineyards.
So, John, now you get to talk a little bit about your favorite vintages of Lytton Springs. So maybe share a little bit of that thought with everyone.
Well, I had the privilege of having the 74 with Paul one time, which, was really an amazing experience, because I don't think, Paul can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think either of us really were sure what to expect. We would have been happy if it would have just been, okay, but it was incredible, the texture of the wine, and really for me there was almost a certain sweetness to it, not in any sort of late harvest sense, but really surprising that it had this sort of middle sweetness to it. So that was obviously a standout. I think there's several vintages from the 90s that I really, really like. 95, 99 stand out. And more recently, I'm a big fan of '09. So that's what comes to mind, but
great.
There's probably many more.
Yeah, exactly. Paul, any other favorites of yours?
Well, I'll just second John's mentioning the 99. I think that's a wine that, if the 74 aged for it's probably going on almost 50 years, 99 is going to go out there forever. It's an incredible vintage of Lytton Springs. But yes, I probably have, a number of favorites, even starting back in the early 90s, before the, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There were some beautiful wines that are showing beautifully today. So, and then of course, we get up to the more recent ones. And once, John took over making the Lytton, and John, that would be what, fully up at Lytton in 03, or what would that be?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have been just stunned by the consistency of vineyard character and the quality of the wines. I thought I was doing pretty well in those earlier years, but John has just taken that and given us a series of Lyttons that are
great. Okay, I think we're ready to move on now to the final wine of the tasting, which is the 2010 Montebello. And this wine is, again, a wine that we probably could have opened yesterday and it would be tasting fantastic right now. Most of us opened it a couple hours before the tasting here today, and either decanted.
Yeah, I've got my 2 hours now that I double decanted it, and it's still.
So tell us about this wine, Eric.
Oh, well, 2010, it was a fairly mild growing season, cool long winter. We had a cool summer, and then out of nowhere at the end of August, that's when we had the devastating 2-day heat wave that really wreaked havoc on the Zinfandel vineyards, where we ended up losing almost half our crop. Here at Montebello, temperatures were more moderated, never got too hot. In fact, after that heat wave, we really didn't see any more heat again. We had just cool weather through September into October. We had a couple storms come through, not with much rain, but just enough to kind of keep us from picking, and it really slowed us down. I remember a couple times being up at the crush station and rushing to get fruit covered from the rain as it was coming through. We were picking it in and around as I was watching the weather, the Doppler radar, and seeing bands of moisture coming through, and could we pick or did we have to wait? It was just one of those kind of crazy vintages. But the wine just turned out beautiful. It's so dark, really rich. Having carefully fermented everything, again, with the discipline of a real strict selection, we were able to assemble a really fine Montebello with a lot of concentration and weight. It's a vintage that's going to age extremely well. Here it is. We're coming into 10 years, and it's still really young. When I first tasted it, it felt like a 5-year-old Montebello. But yeah, it's a gorgeous wine. It's 74% Cab. We've got 20% Merlot, 4 Petit Verdot, and 2 Franc. And as I've been mentioning, I mean, if anyone's been listening to these or joining us for these virtual tastings, you know, when you do see all 4 varieties make it into the assemblage, even through a blind tasting where everything is randomized and we're purely looking for those individual lots. When you see all 4 grapes that make it into the blend, that's the sign that everything ended up working out perfectly with weather for us to get all 4 grapes to a point to be able to join the assemblage. So it's a sign of a really great vintage of Montebello.
And Eric, the great thing too is that Bordeaux produced a wonderful 2010. And so though we don't compare and haven't for years, it's one of those vintages that you can say, all right, Bordeaux did beautifully. If you want to taste Bordeaux and a Californian, you can taste them and it's going to be fair for everybody.
Absolutely, yeah. We're better to compare ourselves to the success of a Bordeaux vintage than to Napa because our climate is so different. I mean, we're much more similar to Bordeaux, even though we're thousands of miles away. We just tend to parallel Bordeaux much more closely than we do Napa, which is only 100 miles away. But also, we're also trying to maintain...
And I guess part of that is the ripeness that's typical. And given our climate, our cool climate, we get full flavor, full ripeness at a much more moderate level of ripening the grapes. So that it's really now, it didn't used to be, but it's now in a totally different style.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, here we have a 13.2 alcohol in a cool vintage. Yeah, it meant we were picking out into late October, but getting beautiful ripeness. And usually what saves us here at Montebello is the fact that we have elevation. We get inversion layers. So when there is periods of warmth, that warm air from Silicon Valley will rise up and will be in that nice cushion of warm air at night to help with the vines getting that extra energy to ripen. So most vintages we are saved by just being on a mountain, having the inversion, you know, being able to get enough sunshine as well. So we're avoiding the fog that tends to blanket down low in the valley. You know, as you're driving up Montebello Road, it'll be foggy at the bottom, but then you'll break through the fog, and then where all our Bordeaux plots are, you're in pure sunshine. And while it may be cool, at least the vines are getting sunshine for photosynthesis.
So Eric, we talked a little bit about the assemblage tasting and process with respect to both Lytton Springs and Geyserville. But in a way, it's the most intensive exercise when it comes to doing the assemblage for the Montebello. So talk a little bit more about
Yeah, well, that's because the vineyard is so complex. You know, we're growing at 4 different historic ranches, beginning at 1,300 feet, going all the way up to 2,700 feet here at Peroni. And you have all these different aspects and you know, different slopes and exposures, and where water kind of runs into ravines, and on terraces, you've got stress, you have vines that are tapped into better water resources. So we have to break the vineyard up into as many as like 70 different pickings, you know, bringing the fruit in, you know, on that day when we taste, you know, we're walking through sampling, tasting, deciding, okay, let's pick just this section. We'll bring it in, receive it into a small tank, work those grapes, pump over, extract, and, you know, end up with a small lot. You know, we'll keep everything in separate barrels after the vintage. So we don't begin the assemblage process until about 3 to 4 months after harvest. After everything's been barreled down, we wait, you know, the wines are more finished at that point. We can blind taste all the different ingredients to then pick and choose very carefully the very best that have really captured the Montebello character. And so depending on the growing season and where the heat and warmth of the vintage, you know, is more optimal, you've got different spots on the mountain that are more of a contribution to Montebello. You know, so if it's a hot year, you may be relying on blocks that have a lot more exposure to the Pacific, where they get more cooling. In a cold year, you're going to be looking for those spots that have gotten better protection, not as much exposure from the ocean, and where it's warm enough to ripen them better. And so the assemblage is always one of the most fascinating tastings of the year. And it's not something we do in one day. It's held over 2 days to do the first assemblage. And then we'll do a second assemblage where we're doing some fine tuning of the first assemblage. And it's a gradual process where we're all tasting and picking and choosing very carefully the best ingredients of the year.
And I love the fact that David and Kyle are sitting there representing the vineyard, and they can see as they taste blind and then are identified the individual lots, and they can explain or look at what did they do in that block that might have turned out what they're seeing in that glass. And so for them too, it's the ultimate of the year. It's kind of the most important moment for all of us, looking at all those individual wines. And Eric, you know, I'm just thinking back, you joined in what, mid-90s, something like that. First in the lab as a brilliant scientist, but someone who didn't have any experience in wine, and then working with me and working with the crew over those years and asking, the second year or something, can I do something in winemaking? Can I help out in that? And so we worked together, and when you had taken over the winemaking, again, especially for me looking back at the 80s and the fact of we had some great vintages, but the consistency that you have brought to the wines that you've made now at Montebello is far beyond what I was able, at least for example, in the 80s to achieve. I mean, it's really a perfecting of these characteristics.
Yeah, well, it's perfect. I mean, everything I learned from you, the techniques, I mean, the discipline that we have, and then just, you know, your interest in having us just press quality every year, higher and higher, figure out what we can do both in the vineyard and in the winery to just make the wine better and press ourselves. And that's how we've been able to really strive and keep pressing the quality higher with every vintage. You know, just being more on top of what's going on in viticulture and in winemaking, but not with ever or abandoning any of our natural methods.
I was going to say,
still holding on to those traditional methods, but just seeing what we can do to really further perfect it.
What I was going to jump in and say, I see Dave smiling because he joined in '89, right, Dave?
Yeah.
So Dave is over 30 years now.
So what are you doing out in that vineyard to get that consistency? And you know, talk a little bit. People ask questions about thinning and managing the crop to make sure we can get it. You know, if it's overcropped, is it a trouble for getting it ripe, especially at Montebello? So talk about that.
Sure. Well, first thing I'll say is that the great thing about growing wine grapes is it doesn't really matter how pretty the vines look or how beautiful the fruit is. It just matters what the fruit tastes like and what the wine turns out. And that's why the assemblage tastings and tasting with the, you know, what we've done in the vineyard, tasting that in the tanks and in the barrels is so important. Plus it's kind of cool. It's not like, not to disparage wheat farmers or corn farmers, but you know, that when you're growing wheat or corn, it becomes more of a commodity. Now there are some commodity grapes and wines out there, but that's not what we do. We can't afford to do that up here. So it's nice to be able to grow grapes that go into wines that can age so beautifully, like Montebello. So let's see, as far as yields, we're up in the hills, and our yields are never what you can get down in the valley in the richer alluvial soils that, you know, say make up most of where most grapes are grown in California. So, but we do have to watch our yields. Some years, if set is really good, especially in Merlot or Petit Verdot, we need to do some thinning, and that thinning kind of depends on the year. So, and often we will look at the year, and if it's going really late, and it got up to a late start, or it's been a really cool summer, then we make a decision at veraison, which is when the grapes turn color and start to accumulate sugar, we make a decision that maybe even though we don't have really high yields as you would compare to other spots in California, we still need to do some thinning. Typically, in most years, we always thin the young vines because they're kind of precocious and they need to be thinned. We always thin Petit Verdot. And then the older vines of Cabernet and Merlot, it really depends on the year and what they've done for us. So it's really year by year, case by case, block by block. There's no real recipe.
And David, I love the fact that, of course, you were helping manage vineyards in Napa before you joined us 30 years ago. And so you came up to Montebello. And at first, I was really worried that you were going to prune too long and leave too much crop. And those first couple of years, it seemed to me was a learning experience that you had to see that if we were going to ripen the crop by winter, you really had to be careful in your pruning, you had to prune back, and you had to be ready to thin.
Absolutely, Paul. And I also learned that you can add 3 times the vines per acre, but your yields don't go up by 3.
Yeah.
So I think we're getting towards the end of our time together. And I think to finish up, and again, we've had a lot of questions about, for Montebello specifically, favorite vintages. So I think we're going to go around. We'll do all the panelists on this one. So maybe John, we'll start with you. Why don't you just give us, each person give me 2 vintages that you like.
2 vintages, wow. Well, I guess the first ones that pop into mind are 84 and 96. 84 because it's a wine that to me just exemplifies how at perfect maturity a wine almost becomes sort of ethereal. I mean, it's all aroma, it's all flavor, it's all complexity, it's completely resolved. So that's, definitely has made an impression on me. 96, well, that's the year I started. And also it was a wine, really low yields, the concentration and yet the balance of the wine for me was always impressive. I think I haven't had it in a while, but I think it's still very young. Mm-hmm. And I guess I just feel I have a hunch it's going to be one of those that, even at 45 and 50 years, a lot of people are going to be talking about.
So Dave, how about you?
Oh, I have to do 91. That was my 3rd vintage. And for me, that was the wine it was a tough year because it took a long time to get ripe. We were picking well into October that year. And it's not a huge wine. It never was a huge wine, but it never had a dumb phase where Montebello kind of can become a little uninteresting when it's between, say, 2 or 3 years and 7 or 8 or 9 years. It never had that. So it was always very up and beautiful, and it's going to age forever. Another vintage that I like, a more recent vintage that I like, is 2000. And that's, I love it because, the California wines and Cabernet, especially in the wine press, it's always about Napa. And 2000 was not a good year in Napa, but it's a glorious year for Montebello. That wine is absolutely delicious right now, and it has been for the last 7 or 8 years, and it will continue to be for as long as I live, I'm sure.
Great. So Eric, how about you?
Well, Dave picked the ones that I was going to choose. I mean, 91 is like the most amazing Montebello I think I've ever tasted. I mean, well, there's so many to choose from. For me, I guess, one of the most amazing, gosh, it goes back to quite a while back that Paul, after harvest, we all got together and had a dinner up at his house, and he pulled out a 64. And I remember opening the bottle. It was like opening a perfume bottle. I mean, it was just this incredible aroma of Montebello that filled the air. And it had so much color still. I mean, it was really old at that point, but still really solid vintage, really incredible year. And that was a really wonderful wine that we had that night. More recent vintage, I mean, I'm drawn to like 2002, another really low yield year, like 96. Really opaque, very sensuous wine, really deep flavors. It's going to age forever. But we didn't make much that year, sadly, because we had Ranger and Bloom, and we really did a narrow selection that year. So we did kind of a super selection to make the 2002 Montebello.
Excellent. Okay, Paul, your turn.
If you'll give me 3 vintages, rather than 2.
All right, I'll give you 3. But I'll give you 3. But I'll tell you, I know one of them is from when I was 10 years old. So, which is also one of my favorite vintages of Montebello. So go.
Well, I'll start with the fact that when Stephen Spurrier decided to set Paris tasting here, and the vintage that we were just releasing was the 71. And I had wished that what he took back with him was the 70, because it's this much more structured wine that I knew then was going to age forever. But he chose the 71. And to give you an idea, of course, as most of you know, it came in second out of the California wines in the original tasting. But then in the 30-year repeat, it came in first by 18 points over all the Bordeaux's and the Californians. And most of those wines were really beginning to fade. The 71 was not. Like the descriptions that several of you have given of the 91 right from the start, it was in balance and just aging beautifully. And my one regret, because we've opened several bottles in the last a couple of years, it is still has not begun to fade at all. And if they did a 40-year repeat, there would be no question of where the Montebello. Very arrogant, but it is a beautiful vintage that was not a big year. It was cool, and it was not hugely tannic. And yet I think the secret of that wine and the majority of our wines is balance. So 70 would be the other that I mentioned. But then I've got to go to the favorite that's been mentioned, and that is the 91. It's the closest thing to the 71 in terms of cool year, not a huge wine, but just that perfect balance that's going to carry it out there, hopefully for the 40 years or more that the 71 is going. So those are my 3.
Yeah. Excellent. Fantastic. Well, I want to thank all the panelists for joining us today and sharing their expertise and knowledge over these wines. I appreciate the fact that you've taken the time out of your day to view this panel and this tasting. We will be doing this again next week at 4 o'clock. We encourage you to go to the website and sign up to join us. And with that, I think we're going to sign off and say good evening and cheers, everyone. Enjoy your wine.
Cheers.
Thank you. All right.
Yeah, cheers.
Bye.